European settlers committed the largest act of genocide that our planet has ever seen. Through military conflict, through the intentional and accidental spread of disease, through controlling the buffalo population, through forced relocation. There were so many different ways in which this country's early government attempted to exterminate the indigenous population that existed before settlers showed up. And that genocide extended into what the Canadian government now calls cultural genocide, with things like Indian boarding schools where children were made to believe and to think that they needed to be more white, that they needed to be more Western. So Signs of Your Identity is a project that explores the legacy of Indian residential schools. The work that I've done so far largely focuses on the school system in Canada, which ran from 1870 until 1996. And it was a network of boarding schools where young Native children would be forcibly taken from their homes and sent sometimes hundreds of miles away, where they would be told that they could not speak their own languages, they could not practice their culture, and they had to assimilate into Western and Canadian culture. That first trip, I spent a month in Canada. I shot largely straight documentary images on a digital camera, and a lot of that work had to do with people who were still struggling with the legacy of coercive assimilation in North America, but all had ongoing struggles with substance addiction. And I realized that a lot of the photos that I'd taken, while they were a very truthful, accurate depiction of the reality of that family, of that community, of a lot of different Native communities, they, on their own, did not tell the whole story. They perpetuated a narrative that was stigmatizing, and it wasn't the part of that narrative that I wanted to share. And so I spent about 2 weeks interviewing 45 Indian residential school survivors, and from that made a series of multiple exposure portraits. So 2 images that were superimposed, one of which was a portrait of the person I'd interviewed, and the second of which was something that had to do with their memory, their experience in residential school. I was interviewing when First Nations people found out I was Jewish. There was immediately this moment of, oh, so you understand. You know what it's like to have genocide be part of your ethnic identity, of your consciousness, that like we have that in common. And I think that's true. I routinely speak to predominantly Black classrooms in DC, and there is instantly this realization of, this sounds a lot like the Black experience in America. The most important thing I want students to take away is I want them to always be thinking about where their history textbooks come from, who is in charge of writing those texts, whose perspectives are represented, what narratives are flattened and left out. And the history of people of color in the United States is often marginalized, is often relegated to footnotes. And that is damaging. That is a form of erasure. And if we are not completely acknowledging our history, including the more embarrassing parts of our history, we are erasing the identity and the struggles of a lot of different ethnic groups. So in Canada and Australia, it has now become standard practice to do what's called land acknowledgement. So before a government gathering, before any large event, someone will come up and say, we'd like to pay our respects to the traditional occupiers of this territory, whether it is the Ojibwe or the Cree or the Algonquin. And I think even that act of acknowledgement, when you're talking about genocide, when you're talking about historical trauma, the first step to healing, the first step to reparations is always acknowledgement. And you think about the Holocaust and the annual day of remembrance that Jews have, and you think about the first mantra to come out of 9/11 was never forget. That act of acknowledgement, of remembering, is really important psychologically.